Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join one of our webinars. Our topic today that we will be talking about is improving your logistics business with the power of data analytics. Before we get started, I'd just like to cover some housekeeping notes. So the recording, the webinar will be recorded, and we will send the recording out to everybody that's registered for this session. And please note that the chat function has been disabled, so all questions can be posted through the Q&A. Our speakers today are Felix Marzian, our Senior Director of sennControl and Shipper Portal, as well as Lukas Lögler, who is a Program Manager at sennControl. Our agenda for today is formatted in the way of questions. So our three questions that we'll be covering are: what key metrics should you focus on when partnering with freight forwarders? How can you integrate performance data into day-to-day operations? And lastly, how can shippers be supported best in gathering, analyzing, and leveraging that data? I'm going to hand over to Felix, who is going to set the stage for us for today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bianca. Thanks for the introduction and great to be here. Indeed, I'd like to set the stage for this webinar briefly for everyone who dialed in. Thanks for coming. I'd like to take a step back and refer a little bit to the current challenges that are surrounded by shippers. So when we think about the current challenges that we already had in 2020 or 2019 pre-COVID, and also now we're thinking about 2022 pre this very sad European war, the market was already very intransparent and basically heavily circulating. However, now in 2022, it reached new dimensions. So this means that basically the shippers have increasingly challenges that they have to overcome. How we are seeing it, or how I see it, is that there's on the one hand market challenges, on the other hand internal shipper challenges, and lastly, the customers are getting way more demanding. So with all these challenges, shippers have to deal. You can imagine what I will say now. Data is the key for that, to overcome these challenges, or at least help solving them. And when we look into market challenges, of course, on the one hand, cost increases. So fuel costs, when we look into 2022 versus 2022, increased by almost 100%, so they doubled down. Pressure on price. Material costs increase. So for example, AdBlue increased in the last 1.5 years by 400%. Labor costs increased. And lastly, also when it comes to carbon emission reduction, which is requested by the EU Commission to be basically to reduce 55% by 2030 and be carbon neutral in the EU by 2050, this is something that shippers have to deal with and buffer out. In addition to that, when we think about internal shipper challenges, they have usually quite complex procurement processes. They have quite complex carrier management processes. And last but not least, also they have internal processes that maybe hinder them on operating very efficient. Thinking about carrier procurement process, which is the complexity here, is that actually due to these fluctuating macroeconomics, of course, when it comes to price negotiations in this untransparent sphere, and there's no legit data tracking behind this, it will be very hard to have a sufficient, to go on sufficient price negotiations if they're basically just based on one person's knowledge and not being made based on a data set that basically says like, and this is the current price that we should deal with. Lastly, customers get more demanding. I'd like to call out here that, of course, a very high OTP, OTD, so better performance is always required. In that sense, if a shipper doesn't have sufficient data tracking, how to basically understand how to increase performance. Yeah? So what we believe in, what we think is the key is to track data, what Lukas will refer on in a bit, not on a very macro level. So this means as a shipper as a whole, but go really deep into the KPIs on a country level, on a warehouse level, on a carrier level, and then basically understand how to increase performance. So in this sense, this pressure needs to be released. This is our takeaway, and we would like to reiterate on that in the coming minutes.
Great, thank you, Felix. I really think that that's given everybody a good context. And our first question is, what key metrics should you focus on when partnering with freight forwarders? I think, Lukas, you're going to take this over.
Yes, thank you very much, Bianca, and also Felix for setting the stage here. Also a warm welcome from my side. Happy to be here. So let's talk about data, what Felix basically just triggered. We believe that you can solve a lot of the current problems that you may face with data. However, data is a word that can be interpreted in many ways, and also the amount of data that you may face can be tremendous. So basically, you may have unlimited possible amounts of data that you can gather, but it's really important that you focus on the relevant one that ultimately can really create value for you and translate into benefits for you. There is no value of just collecting data, having them all stored in a beautiful data warehouse, and in the end, not making really beneficial use of it. So this is why we would like to here present the types of data that we see in the logistics industry as most relevant, also based on the feedback that we got from our customers over the last years. And as Felix already triggered, it can be divided into macro KPIs and micro KPIs as we see it. The type of data or the pure metrics that you can derive from them are the same. However, the level of granularity, sorry for that, can be largely different. So let's look at the different types of data first that you could gather. We have, of course, business and financial data, very basic, like the number of shipments, the revenue that you get from these loads, but also the costs that you face when you give this load to a carrier. You have performance and tracking data, like OTP, OTD, which is performance, so the on-time pickup and on-time delivery performance, but also GPS tracking data. And then you also have environmental data, which is becoming increasingly important on the shipper side because reports are expected both by investors and by regulators. And now, of course, you may gather all this data and calculate these metrics on an overarching level to get insights for your business as a whole, but to really derive insights which will translate into takeaways and into actions that you can take to make your operations better, we believe that you have to collect this data and also look at it on a very granular level. This is when it comes to micro KPIs. So the micro KPIs also refer to all the buckets just mentioned. So business financial data, performance and tracking data, environmental data, you name it. But you do not only track it on an aggregate level, but on carrier level or on warehouse level. Both this macro and micro view is really important, of course, depending on the target audience that you have. You may have senior management, finance, you may have operations who are interested in very different views and in very different types of data. However, in general, we believe you can say the more granular the data source, the better, because a more granular data source gives you the possibility to really dive deep into your daily operations and derive insights from there. However, of course, it's important that you can also process it and make sense out of it. This is again what I said, you have to focus on the data that is relevant for you and that you can use to actually derive valuable insights. And we will come to how we may support you in this, or in general, partners may support you in this in 2 slides. Just what you also mustn't forget always is it's not only about the data collection and having it all. So you now selected the important data for you and you have it all stored in your data warehouse. You actually have to process it. And this is when we look at the right-hand side of this slide, generate insights from collecting data. When you have clean data, you can use this to really create value from it, because you can operational recommendations can be derived from it. So for example, when you see that there are frequent delays in loading or unloading at a certain warehouse level, you can take action. You can benchmark the carriers, which we do at sennder on a weekly level, by taking not only the financials, of this carrier, but also the on-time pickup, the on-time delivery performance that they're tracking, and other important metrics that on carrier level we gather. Then the freight payment accuracy may be important for the finance department, so that you can see actually, okay, what did a load bring us? What did a load cost? Were all the invoices later then issued correctly? Were all the claims and accessorials taken into account correctly? Commercial forecasting can then, of course, be derived from it. And again, on the sustainability part, carbon footprint can be reduced when you collect granular data, because you may optimize your overall network. You may create round trips. You may reduce empty kilometers. You may, with the right partners, partner on alternative fuels. And for actually taking this action to go into the direction of reducing carbon emissions, you first need to understand what is actually happening in your network. All of these 5 points, so the upper 5 bullet points that I just explained, are rather a mid to long-term planning perspective. Of course, data can also support you in your daily operations. So if you have the ability to both gather and process real-time data, this may allow you also for real-time decision-making. So you can proactively communicate delays that are expected and then take action in planning your warehouses, planning your production, and so on. So no matter which area you want to focus on, be it rather the real-time data processing and deriving insights from it real-time, or the mid to long-term aspects, in the end, the insights that you can create from data will allow you to optimize your supply chain. And potentially, of course, also to reduce costs and to increase the performance. So let's probably take a deeper look at the last point that I just talked about, the real-time data and how it may affect your daily operations. So thanks a lot. Thinking about the usual life cycle of a load. It goes from somewhere to somewhere. So we have the load from A to B, and in between there's the transport, which is executed by the carrier. Now, how can you integrate this performance data that can be collected both during loading and unloading and during the ride into your day-to-day operations? We think that visibility is the key to take action based on what is happening during the load. So when we start at the warehouse factory, you have to know what's going on. You have to know, has the carrier been there on time? This is the on-time pickup. You have to know how long did the loading take to potentially take actions and optimize your processes at the warehouse. The delays during loading can then be analyzed and action taken. And of course, also on a carrier level, it is important which carriers are the most reliable in your network. Now, once the carrier picked up a load, during the whole road transport, you may be interested in real-time GPS status updates. However, they may be communicated to your own system, or you get visibility through a platform like our shipper portal. But you are able to see where the truck is, and this creates a certain amount of trust and feeling if the truck will be there on time and what's happening at the moment. Of course, this is not only, you are not limited to this view on a beautiful map with a little truck icon, but you can also get proactive delay notifications. If you take into account current traffic data and the position of the truck, you can calculate an ETA, and then the respective warnings can be issued to you so that you can take actions again. Of course, also during this journey, again, carbon emissions are calculated based on the speed, based on the distance, and also you may get status updates on other things that are currently impacting the truck. So it's not, when you think about data on the road, it's a lot about GPS and logistics, but you can go beyond that. So you can not only provide the position of the truck, but you can also provide information about the status of the truck. So be it the temperature in the free-go truck, be it the load weight, be it the breaks that the driver takes. This all may be relevant data that may help to optimize your network. Once arrived at the final destination, you of course have an on-time delivery. Hopefully it will be on time. You can again record the unloading time, so see how long the process takes, optimize this potentially, and record all the delays on a carrier level again, which will allow you to later then benchmark your carriers and potentially take actions like replacement, looking for other freight providers here. So this is basically the whole idea behind how to collecting and then analyzing data to make use of it, and by this create value for you. And it may seem a bit overwhelming at first, because you may ask yourself, do I actually have the right IT infrastructure? Do I have the knowledge that is needed for processing this data? How can I get my carriers to provide this data to me? How can I get my warehouses to provide this data and to collect it all in a central place to then make use of it? And therefore, we would like to now on the next slide give you an insight on how we think you can be supported best as a shipper in both gathering, analyzing, and then deriving insights from this data.
Absolutely.
So Felix, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Lukas. Absolutely. I think the question is now like how to get into action. And I think what Lukas just said correctly, it starts somehow with a data-driven mindset first. And then second to that, it starts with the question, do we want to do this basically in-house? Are we able to basically, and this is the magic key behind it, to connect all carriers in a digital way to our system? Will this work or not? Because basically the connection to carriers is basically the bottom line to be basically data agile. And in that sense, shippers then have multiple options, of course, but on the one hand, they can say, hey, I go for a company, for example, sennder, giving them a 10% share of my business. We carry it out. Sennder does connect as a standard to all carriers, and therefore I get on 10% of my business a data-driven answer to my road freight logistics performance. Maybe there's 2-3 other carriers which can do as good as sennder or at least similar. And then I maybe have like a 40% tracking across my road freight supply chain. But if I have like these 3-4 carriers who are basically on this level of data tracking, of connecting with carriers, with warehouses, there is still a gap which is not filled of 60% with maybe carriers which are not yet in the digital age, which are reluctant to connect, which might have a very good price, but that might be the only argument to work with them, but are reluctant to basically connect, and therefore by connecting are reluctant to provide additional data points. So this means on the one hand, option one is to basically go for the setup of having multiple carriers, but multiple carriers which perform different on a data provision level, I would call it. And or option number two could be, and this is something that we're looking very much into in the last couple of years, and having set up with multiple shippers by now, is a control tower setup. Why is a control tower setup very beneficial if you think about a data-driven approach when analyzing the road freight FTL supply chain? Because at the end of the day, a control tower is nothing else than a single point of contact who's basically gathering everything together. So this means in a control tower setup, you have the assurance that the control tower connects, first and foremost, challenges the status quo. This is really important. Challenges the current network of a shipper, the carrier network. Following that, basically being the single point of contact who's then taking care of all procurement activities in a very data-driven way, not only in a price way, but what is the OTP, OTD per carrier? What is the penalties that the carrier causes? What is the willingness to perform upon CO2 reduction targets that the shipper has, yes or no? And then basically bring this into a certain metrics and then bucket these carriers and say, like, these are the carriers that you currently have in your network. These are the carriers that should be switched. These are the carriers that perform pretty well. And then basically have this procurement process on an ongoing basis. Secondly, in such control tower setup, when basically not only gathering this data, processing the data, but also making sense of the data, this is when the operations part comes in place. So this means basically using data to enhance performance in operations on a day-to-day basis. And then as a last pillar, of course, grant full and what Lukas referred to when it comes to day-to-day visibility, day-to-day tracking, day-to-day recommendation management, and or also post-mortem transport execution analytics. And how can this be done? This can be done on the one way in a shipper portal. So basically full transparency in a shipper portal to track loads, to get access to PODs, to have post-transport execution analytics, which can be spread around the company, to a management board, to shareholders, what Lukas was referring to anyone who's basically interested in the data of the road transportation, and or build an API to basically process data between two parties. That can be from the shipper coming to the control tower processing orders, that can be vice versa back from the control tower to the respective shipper, proactive delay notifications, analytical sets, PODs. So summing it basically up, there are various ways to make sense out of data, gather data, analyze data, and basically leverage this data. It is up to the shipper which setup is the one that makes, from their point of view, sense to be enforced. However, we believe it starts with a data-driven mindset, and besides this data-driven mindset, with the right carrier setup in place, a carrier setup which is willing to basically collaborate to be able to track data and then leverage this data with a third-party provider or in-house. Fantastic.
Great,
Bianca,
thank you.
thank you.
We'll move on to the Q&A session now, and I think we've got quite a lot of questions which touch on what you've said, which is really great. The first one I might pick out is just because it's related to what you just presented, Felix, but one of our attendees is asking, does sennder have a separate carrier qualification process for control towers? So
we don't have a separate qualification process for carriers, for control towers. No, we don't. Because the existing process that we also use in our brokerage operations is pretty sophisticated. So there is not a difference if you work in a control tower setup from basically, let's say, the vetting of carriers, because this is a sennder standard. If you do 10% share of the business with carriers, or if you do 100% in a control tower setup, if it comes to benchmarking, analyzing and changing carriers, if the question maybe also refers a bit to that, then I say yes. So in a control tower setup, there is a more turning wheel when it basically comes to analyzing the data of the carriers and making sense. I'd like to drop here one important number. In the FTA road freight industry, around 15% of the trucks are GPS tracked. This is quite a low number. We at sennder, having now trading around a proudly number of around 70-ish%. We're trying to be across the company at around 90% plus by mid-end next year. However, in all of our control tower setups, we're having a GPS tracking ratio of 90%, 95% plus and beyond, because it's a prerequisite in a control tower setup to basically do good data gathering and then of course processing and the execution of it. Yes.
Okay, great. I think a good follow-up question from that as well is, Lukas, maybe you want to jump in here, but how are we actually tracking that GPS data at sennder? So we've got this goal, you said we've already made great progress, but how are we doing that?
So GPS data is tracked via different devices that can be installed in the truck, and we partner with the major data providers, for example, P44, CO3, who actually take all this data, gather it, put it in a readable way, and then we retrieve the data from them. Also, because not all carriers may be open to actually connect their truck to such providers and to such networks. We also developed an own sennder app, which allows to track a truck based on the smartphone of the driver. Very easy to use, but also gives us the core data, so the current position of the truck, which also allows us to track a truck and thereby increase our overall tracking rate way above what would be possible only if we would rely on the truck inbuilt devices. However, I also want to mention here, often the pure focus is on GPS tracking. We may not forget that we are now living in 2022 and we have quite sophisticated trucks. And these trucks can deliver data that goes beyond GPS. And we have a very strong partnership with the data provisioner CO3. And we can collect data that goes beyond GPS. For example, I already mentioned the temperature in the Frigo truck, the weight of the truck, which can also be used to identify theft and alarm the driver. You can even track when a door has been opened. You can track when the truck has been fueled and all of this. So all of this data gathering is done with partners or in-house by solutions developed by sennder themselves.
Okay. We do have a follow-up question to that, and I think it touches a little bit more on sort of the CO3 part of their scope. But one of our attendees is asking how we manage the installation of trackers. Isn't it ops heavy and requires additional resources? But I think that touches more on sort of what CO3 covers, right?
Yeah, I mean, so the device is needed for that. The actual device is already in the trucks. So what the main task here for CO3 is to actually get the carrier companies to agree on connecting these trucks. And as we are working very closely with CO3, we can leverage our good carrier relations and thereby convincing a carrier that it makes sense also for them to connect their truck to the CO3 network. And then we can leverage the data via CO3 who are connected with these. I think it's 328 was the last number that I heard, data provision devices, and they are gathering it, they are putting it in a format that is readable for sennder, and then we can use this data to make sense out of it. So there is not, the challenge is actually not that big because the devices are already in the trucks.
Yeah. Okay, great, thank you. Slightly different tangent now, focusing more on the green business. But what is the green business offering from sennder, and are these deliveries made with electric trucks? I know that's not your specific area of expertise, but I think you can probably talk about it.
That's fine, still some expertise on it, as we have quite a big focus at sennder to contribute to a carbon neutral reduction by 2050. So in that sense, to the question, sennder focuses currently mainly on HVO. So HVO fuel stations are pretty well set up across the Netherlands or the Benelux in general. Across France and Germany is also speeding up. So you have sort of like a triangle between these 3-4 countries of HVO stations. We are offering this in any control tower setup to basically have alternative fuels with it, but also in our normal core brokerage, this is absolutely possible. There is, we do a combination of HVO direct, we call it. So this means that the actual truck, which is from the shipper, is being fueled with HVO, or there's also the possibility of HVO flex. HVO flex means basically a offsetting. So this means the shipper gets the certificate that basically HVO has been used, but it's maybe fueled in another truck from another shipper, which is circulating in this triangle that I was just referring to. To the question quickly with electric trucks, sennder is looking into this, and without spoiling too much, we are on the verge to bring the first electric trucks on the road. It's a very minor share yet, also just due to technology, how it's been developed so far, but it's top of mind for us. But if you ask what is the major let's say, green approach that we're driving at the moment, it's HVO.
Yeah. Perfect.
May I quickly add to this?
Sure.
Just when we talk about green logistics, it's not only about the fuel that you are using. It's also about, for example, creating round trips and thereby reducing empty kilometers. And of course, sennder is well positioned to create these round trips, to combine the transports of different shippers to thereby overall reduce the carbon that is emitted. So there are several ways how you, and with our help, can reduce your carbon footprint.
Yeah, great. Thank you for adding that on, Lukas. Thank you so much, both. I think that was very insightful, and I hope that our attendees have taken a lot out of that as well. As I mentioned at the start, we will be sending the recording out, so if anybody wasn't able to join, this will be sent out afterwards as well. But otherwise, have a great afternoon. Thank you.